So I actually want to start this talk with a eulogy, and it is a eulogy for a fish named Alice. So I'm going to start with a little story. In June last year, British cardiologist Ben Besker went out into his garden after hearing a group of magpies making a lot of noise. And on his lawn, he discovered a white and orange goldfish. And he tweeted a picture of this goldfish saying, today I found a goldfish just on the grass in my back garden. It was alive, I think, and have absolutely no idea where it came from. There's no ponds anywhere near, so I took it inside. So he put the fish inside an old freezer drawer, which was all he could find, filled with water, and it started to swim around. And Ben texted a friend saying it's alive, which auto-corrected to it's Alice. And so this lucky goldfish was promptly christened Alice. And what followed was a kind of crash course in aquatics for Ben. He rushed out to buy an emergency fish tank, dechlorinator, and bottled bacteria to kickstart the nitrogen cycle. Because contrary to what the sellers of bagged goldfish at fairgrounds would have you believe, you can't actually just stick a fish in a receptacle of tap water and expect it to thrive. An aquarium should be dechlorinated and cycled for 6 to 8 weeks before adding any life. And while we're on the subject, goldfish are actually some of the least suitable fish to keep in home aquaria. But that's another story, and if you're interested in the minutiae of fish keeping, you can ask me about that later. I've been keeping fish since I was about 10 years old, and it's a real passion of mine, and that's where a lot of this research and project comes from. So Ben's story went viral. It made the global news. The internet being the internet that we all know and love, hundreds of people started to criticize him online for Alice's small, uncycled tank. This is one of my favorite tweets. Someone said, please get a much bigger tank. It's baffling how people think fish can live in such small amounts of water. To which Ben replied, surviving better than it was sitting on my back lawn, isn't it, Ava? And the internet also being the internet, Alice actually had her own Twitter account within 24 hours. I also enjoy it. It's just Alice, brackets, fish. So while a fish turning up on a suburban lawn is noteworthy in itself, perhaps even more remarkable were the thousands of enthusiastic responses to Alice's story. Some examples of those are here. So fans depicted Alice in artworks. They wrote haikus inspired by Alice. They sent Ben sort of portraits of Alice. And actually, Alice soon had her own merch line, which was created by Ben, featuring T-shirts, stickers, pins, and tote bags. And the aquarium brand Fluval obviously sensed a good PR opportunity. So they sent Ben a free aquarium and equipment to upgrade Alice's accommodation. And she soon tweeted later that she would have liked a mezzanine in her tank. But barely a week later, unfortunately, Ben tweeted the sad news that Alice had gone to the big fish tank in the sky, having passed from her injuries. And tributes poured in from her fans. She was the people's fish, one fan tweeted, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever. And we got a lot of AI-generated or photoshopped or hand-drawn depictions of Alice in heaven. This is one of my favorites. I'll mention this again later. Friendship bracelets were made in her honor and taken to Taylor Swift's Eras tour. I had to get a Taylor Swift reference in there somewhere, and I did, and it's not even tangential. This actually happened. And Ben himself, I think, went to the Eras tour. Yes, so this is a picture of Alice in spirit and Barney, Ben's new fish, enjoying themselves at the Eras tour and confirming that Taylor Swift is apparently the music of goldfish. So here at Ben's work, his colleagues offered him condolences. Someone photoshopped Alice onto Elton John's Candle in the Wind. Someone tweeted another artwork of Alice saying, swim free, little fish. And Ben's aquarium, which now has new fish in it, features a plaque naming it the Alice Memorial Tank, subtitled, The Fish That Lived for a Bit. And after Alice died, this really struck me, one person tweeted, how do I explain to my friends this afternoon that I'm just a bit sad about the internet fish dying? The fact that people would mourn and memorialize a fish actually feels perfectly normal to me, since I've done so myself on multiple occasions. One of the sad facts about being a passionate aquarist is the fact that you will experience a lot of fish death. Fish have short lifespans, particularly fish in captivity for various reasons. And again, I can talk more about those if you're interested. In 2021, autumn of 2021, I actually posted online about the death of my beloved Siamese fighting fish, Troilus, whose passing had left me really quite bereft. This is a picture of me. This is on the left. Don't think I need to say that. I'm on the left. Troilus is on the right. And on the left, this is a birthday cake I made for Troilus while he was still alive, of himself in cake form. And that's me showing it to him. You can see him absolutely thrilled, of course, at the front of the tank. So when he passed away in 2021, I was really surprised by the reactions of my friends, some of whom sent me flowers, some sent me artwork of Troilus, and one of them even crocheted me a tiny Troilus to go with me on my travels wherever I go. So that's Troilus there in Amsterdam in the picture. And I couldn't help but think, contrastingly, of when I was at school. I was a teenager at school, and one day I came in very sad about the loss of a pet fish, and the girls in my class just laughed at me and treated me like I was ridiculous. So we have I have better friends now is the take-home message here, I think. Now, Ben at one point tweeted that he was reading Jonathan Balcom's best-selling book, What a Fish Knows, after being told off for referring incorrectly to goldfish having a 3-second memory. And despite my friends in those days showing a huge amount of compassion for my grief over a fish, most of my friends know almost nothing about fish. And I like to talk about fish a lot, so I like to teach them. But they don't know a lot about fish. They're always surprised to learn that fighting fish, like Troilus, need to live alone. They can sleep in hammocks made from leaves. They can recognize their owners, and they can actually be trained. They can be trained to eat from your hand, to jump through hoops, and even to participate in aquarium Olympics. I'm going to show you a little clip here from the betta fish Olympic. Betta is another word for Siamese fighting fish. So if you ever wonder what I'm doing in my downtime, it's probably something like this. Now, this confusion and these contrasts about fish are what I want us to think about today. I want us to think about the slipperiness of fish in all senses of the word, epistemologically, emotionally, ontologically, physically. Incidentally, the reason that fish are slippery is something called a slime coat, and it's really important for maintaining fish health, and it's also one of the reasons why you should never pet a fish. So I think the fish embodies a lot of the contradictions surrounding the ways that we as human animals conceptualize and relate to other animals and to the biosphere. I think it's relatively well known by now that we respond with compassion and attention to some animals more than others, particularly, for example, domesticable animals like dogs and cats, and what we call the charismatic megafauna that often become poster animals for environmental campaigns, so elephants, polar bears, tigers. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are probably very few humans who feel a great amount of compassion for or connection with disease vectors like mosquitoes or nuisance animals like wasps. But fish are strangely liminal beings that seem to exist between both worlds. They're as likely to be subjected to normalized cruelty as to cutesy anthropomorphism. Fish entertain and delight us. So in fiction, we have the iconic rainbow fish from the classic children's books, and of course the cast of Finding Nemo, The Little Mermaid, Shark Tales, for example. And in real life, we have quirky phenomena like Utrecht's beloved fish doorbell webcam. That's in the middle here. If you don't know about this, it's great. It's basically, there's a dam, I believe somewhere in Utrecht, where essentially, because of the dam, it means that the fish can't get through a particular route that they need to go, I think, to breed. And so people were trying to figure out how to solve this problem, because we need the dam, but we also need the fish to get through. And so scientists invented this fish doorbell. It's basically a webcam that, as you can see, is focused on the passageway that fish can go through. And the public can watch this webcam. And if there's a fish waiting to get through, they can open the passageway, basically. So the fish sort of rings the doorbell by appearing on webcam, and then it's outsourced to members of the public, and they can open the passage for the fish. We also have, on the right, this is a group of scientists in Israel several years ago taught fish to drive by, you can see the fish is on a sort of, it's in water, of course, on an apparatus resembling almost a tank, actually. Not a tank as in an aquarium, a tank as in a war tank. That was not a pun. And they basically trained fish to swim after food, and in doing so, they would drive the tank towards the food. I think maybe teaching fish to drive was a slightly exaggerated summary of this, but it made good headlines. And it certainly proves that fish are more intelligent than we'd think. It also disproves the myth that goldfish have a 3-second memory, which is not true. You can actually do a basic experiment if you have goldfish or other fish by ringing making a sound, essentially, when the food is going to be dropped in, and they will learn that means food. The same as my old fish, Troilus, for example, knew that me approaching the tank would mean food, and he would swim to the surface. So no 3-second memory there. They're a lot smarter than most myths would have us believe, and they also feel pain, which is something that I'm going to talk about now. The next slide has some slightly distressing images, by the way, so just to warn you, if you are, like me, triggered by animal cruelty, but I think it's important to be aware. Fish are also faceless, often literally faceless, commodities to us. Most fish are sold for food without their heads, for example. And it's interesting the amount of people who will happily eat fish, but when it's presented to them with the head on, suddenly become squeamish. They're commodities whose existence necessitates apparently tolerable cruelty. Salmon, for example, remains a highly popular food despite countless exposés by now about the horror of the salmon farming industry. I won't go into that in detail, you can look it up, but this is a picture of a salmon covered in sea lice, which basically eat the fish alive. And one of the ways to deal with this is to pump the fish full of antibiotics, which is then something that we consume when we eat salmon. Yeah, there are multiple headlines about this. We might profess ourselves horrified by the occasional behind-the-scenes tales of unethical abattoirs for mammals, but leaving fish to suffocate to death or bleed out in the hulls of boats goes unchallenged. And an improperly stocked and improperly cared for aquarium is almost a mainstay, I think, by now in restaurants and dentist surgeries. You find some good ones, but the amount of terrible aquaria I've seen, in restaurants is quite upsetting. The Tasmanian art gallery, Mona, which I visited last January, has an exhibit. You can see it here. It's basically 2 small goldfish in a shallow bowl with a chef's knife inside, perched casually on a chair with no barrier around it where anyone might knock it over or worse. The museum do have a note saying that they rotate the fish out every day so that it's never the same fish in consecutive days. But that's not, if you know anything about fish, you know that that's not mitigating the trauma. Fish do not like a change of environment. They don't like being moved around. They don't like a change in water chemistry. So moving fish between 2 tanks is really stressful for them. So that's not a good enough explanation in my mind. And yeah, fish here become just an accessory, they're just part of the artwork. And when I tell people that I keep fish as a hobby, I will inevitably be regaled with an anecdote of childhood fish neglect or cruelty, relayed lightly and with sort of guilty laughter, like, oh, whoops, like it's merely a standard rite of passage of growing up. But I have yet to this day hear anyone laugh about or normalize, for example, flushing a live puppy down the toilet. It wouldn't be received in the same way. Why do we laugh about this with fish? So, as Alice's story has shown, the space of the aquarium provides, I think, an ideal arena to explore this disconnect. And in her book, The Victorian Aquarium, Sylvia Granata examines what she calls the interaction between the aquarium as a material object and the stories that the Victorians told about it, which in many cases were stories about themselves. And I see something similar in Alice's story, which was sort of appropriated to tell the story of an idealized Britain, in which Alice's bold spirit featured alongside the veteran hero Captain Tom and Princess Diana. So I'm going back to that image there of Alice in heaven. You can see her there next to Captain Tom. I don't know if Captain Tom might be a very British thing, but basically he was I think he was a 100-year-old war veteran who during the pandemic walked up and down his garden possibly 100 times with his walker to raise money for the NHS. You also see the Queen, Princess Diana, Michael Jackson. You know, it's a curious eclectic choice of personae, but yeah, Alice is there alongside these sort of heroes. And Ben is also an interesting phenomenon here as well. So he has a track record of eating fish without any qualms, as you can see from this tweet of his, which Alice humorously responded to. But he genuinely seemed to mourn the passing of Alice and has gone on to stock his aquarium with new inhabitants. And he tells entertaining stories about them on social media. So this is, he has a fish called Barney and a fish called Daphne. And at one point, Daphne claimed the house that he bought for Barney. And, he tells stories about them as if they are people. So like the Victorians before him, Ben indulges in what Granata terms a number of imaginative strategies that cast marine animals as actors on a stage, as pets, or as citizens of a miniature world to be managed. Sorry, that should say a miniature world. By incorporating but also adjusting current attitudes towards animals. And it's this adjustment that I'm most interested in. So Alice's story prompts me to ask, in line with the scholar Astrid Nemanis, how do the stories we tell and the knowledges we draw on to tell them work to establish certain kinds of ethical relations with our watery others? And it's a question that I want to explore today and in future work, particularly in relation to children's literature. So might we one day end up with a generation where not everyone has a terrible childhood goldfish story, where fish are no longer given away as fairground prizes, which still happens, or as casual gifts, which still happens, where children don't walk into pet shops and demand a Nemo from harassed parents with no prior expertise of fish keeping, only to watch Nemo quickly deteriorate in the wrong conditions, to be quickly replaced with another Nemo that will meet the same fate. Incidentally, Nemos are clownfish, that's their actual name, and they are, of course, marine fish, saltwater fish, which means you need a special saltwater aquarium, and saltwater aquaria are even more complicated than freshwater aquaria, which means that Nemo is, like goldfish, one of the least suitable fish to keep as a pet. Might we also end up with a world where fishing for sport is treated with the same outrage and contempt as fox hunting? And if so, how might aquaria and children's books about aquaria help to shape that future? And I'm particularly interested in reading such books through the framework of multi-species justice. So in the words of Silamaya et al., multi-species justice insists on the need to account for other beings with their own radically diverse life projects, capacities, phenomenologies, ways of being, functionings, forms of integrity, and relationalities. Multi-species justice envisages an ecological reality where human and non-human animals, species, microbiomes, ecosystems, oceans, and rivers, and the relations among and across them are all subjects of justice. And multi-species justice, or the desire for it, certainly seems to have informed the first project I want to discuss, which is a picture book that was produced in 2019 by the Seattle Aquarium in the United States. So the Seattle Aquarium pointed out on their blog that animals are regular protagonists in children's books, but these characters are primarily vertebrates and often charismatic animals. This is true. So a study of ocean picture books for children, not even general picture books, published in the Australian Journal of Environmental Education, found that out of a sample of 100, most books that represented tropical marine environments, like coral reefs, they mostly represented coral reefs, and they mostly featured, for example, fish and sharks, big fish, with only one book each representing seagrass meadows, subtidal rocky reefs, and estuaries. And the representation of the creatures that inhabit these environments is also correspondingly low. So you get a lot of, for example, dolphins, sharks, killer whales, but very little coral, focusing on coral, very little focus on rock pool life. So Seattle wondered whether they could create a book that would allow kids and their caregivers to empathize, and empathy is a key concept here, empathize with strange and exotic marine animals like sea anemones or barnacles. But when the Seattle Aquarium approached publishing houses with their first empathy-themed children's book, Catastrophe by the Sea, they were met with responses along the lines of, "We love the charismatic cat, but lose the tide pool creatures. They're boring. No one wants to read about a barnacle." And actually, as a friend of mine pointed out when I mentioned this paper to her, that's maybe not actually true. So a very quick internet search for barnacle on Amazon.com turned up a wealth of merchandise, from pencil cases to notebooks, as well as fiction for children. Books like Jonathan Fensker's Barnacle is Bored. In this book, a barnacle gains a newfound appreciation for his life, his boring life, because he's not at risk of predators like other sea creatures. And Eli Bolz's Life as a Barnacle, which explores a barnacle's search for the place he's going to fix himself and call home. And Granata points out that there's actually a long scientific and literary tradition of trying to cultivate empathy for less charismatic marine life, with the aquarium a key factor in deeply conditioning the way in which tank residents and their relations to humans were perceived. Now, Linda Wason-Ellum notes that years of researching in the classroom has shown me that in quality children's literature, vistas widen when conversations address relationships in social ecology and how we relate to one another, or physical ecology and how we relate to the land and resources. The afterword to Catastrophe by the Sea reminds us that life beneath the waves may be the strangest of all. Ocean creatures look very different and lead diverse lives. This biodiversity strengthens the system, but can make it hard for us to feel connected to these alien beings. Empathy asks us to swim a mile in their fins. They help us see and feel what we have in common with even the most unusual of ocean creatures. Feeling connected to ocean animals includes them in our circle of concern, so we care and conserve them. So I want to argue that children's picture books which focus on less charismatic animals establish a circle of concern on a visual and a metaphorical level that aims to cultivate empathy for historically overlooked or othered life forms. Although Will Aberley notes that our representations of nature might be mediated and inauthentic, their consequences for natural environments and their life systems are all too real. Now, children's books are a really important line of inquiry when it comes to the intricate relationship between what we call blue extinction, empathy, and action, since, as you probably know, children are increasingly burdened with the responsibility of fixing a broken planet, which is something that, for example, Greta Thunberg has spoken very eloquently on and criticized the fact that we tend to hope and assume that the next generation will fix the world that we have ruined. As David Sobel argues, it's important that children have an opportunity to bond with the natural world, to learn to love it before being asked to heal its wounds. Now, Granata points out that the most interesting organisms from a scientific point of view are actually often diminutive or microscopic, like plankton, for example. And this creates a narrative problem. She says, unlike the obviously sensational skeletons of prehistoric creatures like dinosaurs, these tiny organisms could easily fail to impress the casual observer. But the technology of the aquarium played a key role here, particularly during its heyday in the 19th century. Its status as a contained miniature world encouraged people to home in on its potential narratives and to direct their focus to a smaller space. So the two books I'm looking at today use this contained aquatic space, man-made in one case, the aquarium, and natural in another case, the tide pool. They use this contained aquatic space in a similar way, not only to point out the beauty of marine creatures, I'm quoting Granata here, but to elicit wonder for their strangeness while helping readers to make sense of their scientific importance. Sidney Dobrin has argued that we must consider the ethics of scalar representations as central to the formation of how we understand ocean, which in turn links to the idea, Timothy Morton's idea of hyperobjects, if you're familiar with that. These books engage to varying extents with this notion, adopting what I want to call a microcosmic aesthetic to establish a circle of concern to frame and foreground less charismatic marine life. I'm also just going to mention a book. I'm not going to look at this book in detail, but it's a little relevant here. So this is a book called The Rock Pool by David Bellamy, published in 1988. And Bellamy informs his reader in this book that there are hundreds of living things in the pool waiting to be discovered. All you have to do is look. And this is true of the picture books I'll look at today. These texts urge children to develop new ways of seeing, and they encourage them to home in on the miniature as a stepping stone towards envisaging the bigger picture. And I think this is both an epistemological strategy and an emotional one. So careful narrative negotiation between the contained miniature and the wider ocean might be a means of informing children about the world while avoiding what Kelly Swain terms ecophobia, feeling hopeless and disempowered from learning about environmental threats, which incidentally is a different definition of ecophobia to Simon Estock's famous definition, which is contempt or fear towards the natural world. This is more phobia about what we're doing to the world. Claire Echteling points out that the fact that climate change is so hard to get your head around can induce despair in readers. I'm sure many of us have felt this. Environmental catastrophes that manifest themselves gradually and magnify over time present formidable representational obstacles that can hinder our efforts to mobilize and act decisively. Rob Nixon argues that our most pressing environmental problems are characterized by what he terms slow violence, which some of you might be familiar with, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, for example, the biggest one being climate change. Confronting this violence involves representational challenges, how to represent something that stretches so far in time and space. And that is something that, of course, the environmental humanities are, investigating. So these children's books hint at the fact that a productive approach to blue extinction demands alternative modes of representation, which are here typified by the miniature and the contained. And this relates more widely to how the miniature tends to function in children's literature. It's often examined in relation to dolls' houses, which, in the words of Nancy Chen, symbolize the fear of a shift of world orders and the emphasis on accurate proportion as the desire of possessing and knowing all the visible objects in one's own universe. So the doll's house in children's literature is often a way for the child's character to kind of control their surroundings in an adult-dominated world that feels beyond their control. And so I want to suggest that a microcosmic aesthetic within children's picture books with an environmental focus combines the desire for knowledge and control that Chen suggests with an empathetic approach towards seeing with diminutive ocean life. So in 2019, the school library journal praised Catastrophe by the Sea, describing it as a harmonious picture book that celebrates biodiversity and builds empathy for a world that some may overlook or take for granted. And I think this latter statement is maybe proven by another review that found Buddy the barnacle, a character in the book, problematic as he is the main character, but is seldom shown and difficult to spot. But this is maybe the point. The text urges the reader to recalibrate his or her vision in order to see with the tide pool life. So Abberley notes that representations that aestheticize underwater environments, such as carefully curated aquaria, risk framing these environments as valuable purely in terms of the viewing pleasure they offer to humans instead of their ecological functions. But actually, I would argue that this book, Catastrophe by the Sea, presents the rock pool or tide pool less as a visual object and more as an invitation to visualize in a new way. So at the beginning of Catastrophe by the Sea, Catastrophe is the name of the cat, the eponymous cat paws at a sea anemone, who in return sends a jet of salt spray into his face. And he's shocked. He says, "I thought you were dead." And the anemone, whose name is Naimone, says back, "I'm just as alive as you." And I think this exchange is symbolic of the entire book, which urges us to abandon speciesism by establishing an equality between the cat and the tide pool creatures. And I think this is reflected in the illustrations, which devote equal amounts of artistic space to the creatures, to the tide pool creatures and to the cat. And when the Seattle Aquarium noted that one editor suggested that they not name all the characters, but they pointed out that naming the cat but not sensible Buddy the barnacle or Naimone the lovely sea anemone denied the latter two the connection and empathy they so deserve. And I think this connection is consolidated in the book through an urge towards refocalization. So at the beginning of the book, we're told about Catastrophe the cat, that his whole world is now the beach at low tide. That's the third sort of paragraph down. So the text engulfs both Catastrophe and the reader in the microcosmic world of the tide pool, partly through its illustrations. And I think with their abstract two-dimensional nature, they possess a sort of slightly surreal quality that demands the reader pay total attention. At points, the entire page resembles a backdrop, with lines of text representing the conversations in the pool. So the reader is invited to place him or herself within this world, as if overhearing the voices all around. So you see an example of this on the left. Although a reviewer complained that it is sometimes difficult to identify characters in the book, I think this is the point. The reader is asked not merely to spot or identify creatures in a lineup, as is actually the case in a lot of children's picture books. You know, can you spot the caterpillar? Can you spot the ladybird? But instead, to go further, the reader is invited to immerse themselves literally in the world of the tide pool. And Catastrophe's interactions with the pool are, from the beginning, framed in terms of meaningful social interaction and connection. We're told that he's wandered too far from home, and he attempts to find a substitute family in the pool. Who will play with me here, he wonders. And later, Naimone is confused by Catastrophe's solitude, remarking that she has lots of friends in our cozy colony. And when his new friends are submerged by the waves, Catastrophe misses them and their sweet familiar voice. The next morning, he finds them again, and we're told that he pets Naimone, but very gently. You see this on the left. And he purrs at Buddy, "I'm so happy I found you again." And then later he's sucked underwater by a wave and he nearly drowns. And we're told that surf rushes in and fills the tide pools. Sea creatures feed hungrily. Wide open shells, fuzzy little legs, and tentacle fingers snatch plankton and small fish from the surging water. So the focalization is not on Catastrophe's mishap, but on the positive benefits of the wave for the tidal creatures. And I think this is also clear in the illustration, which you see the cat is just a silhouette, and it actually emphasizes the interconnected blue life forms feeding off the wave that is such a threat to mammals like the cat. And later, the focalization shifts even more to the eye view of the pool creatures. So you can see them look through their eyes at the cat looking down on them with his bright blue eyes. And then with this shift, we get probably the most important moment in the book. We're told, sneakers on the sand, racing each other, two children crunch the barnacles, their feet squish the anemones. And I think this moment recalls that famous moment in Robinson Crusoe, you know, the footprint on the sand. It's presented as really ominous. The children are framed as bullies on the beach. And I think this is quite interesting, especially if we look at some of the editor's initial responses to the book. So one of them said, "There's a reason beachcombers step on barnacles and anemones. They're ugly and underfoot. Who cares about them?" And so this comment, interestingly, maps speciesism onto a kind of spatial hierarchy, denigrating life forms that are both literally and metaphorically beneath the human. And it also evokes what Marcus Rediker terms hydrarchy. So those who exist literally above sea level exercise sovereignty over ocean space. As Philip Hoare puts it, our superiority is unbounded in our elevation over the base sea level, as if it were a geographical point beneath which all else is inadmissible. And of course, we know by now that actually probably the oceans are the most important space on this planet in terms of keeping us alive. So Catastrophe by the Sea inverts our spatial relationship to water our spatial relationship to these life forms, these underwater life forms, by inviting us into the tidal space. And it reminds us that humans are situated in relation to water in a very human-specific way, opening up the possibility that we might, in the words again of Astrid and Amanus, imagine ourselves as bodies of water, carrying each other across species, generations, and geographies. As if to affirm this, the book ends with another moment of interspecies connection. It's implied that Catastrophe communicates his newfound affinity with the tide pool creatures to the children. We're told that they seem to understand. This is the second paragraph. They tiptoe carefully around Buddy and his barnacles. They stop to watch Naimone's garden blooming. They learn, in the words of Naimanus, that intimacy with our watery others is not mastery. The children recede into the distance, and once again, as you see on the right, the book zooms in to focus on the anemones. So I'll now look at my second text, and this one I think performs a really interesting narrative and illustrative oscillation between the micro and the macro, identifying the need to shift our perception and our sense of scale if we are to attend to a dying ocean. So it starts with one, is the line that opens and closes this book by Kate Messner and Matthew Forsyth. It's called The Brilliant Deep, Rebuilding the World's Coral Reefs, and it was published in 2018. So this focus on one, on the individual, is apparent from the cover of the book, which places a young snorkeler center stage, framed by a shimmering array of aquatic life. And actually in the book, the real book, there are kind of gold foil parts, so it is quite literally shimmering. And throughout the book, the environmentalist and the coral gamete are conflated through this focus on the individual. As the inside cover states on the right, all it takes is one coral gamete to start a colony, one person to make a difference, one idea to change the world. So the first page spread of the text emphasizes this by repeating the imagery found on the cover, but replacing the snorkeler with a single branch of coral. So I think the book shifts between an anthropocentric viewpoint and one that is focused on static or uncharismatic ocean life forms, implying a contiguity between diminutive marine life and the humans who have a duty to save it. From a spread focused on single coral gametes escaping hungry fish and eels, we shift to the scene of a NASA rocket launch. So we go from the micro to the macro. And the protagonist of our story, who we see on the left as a young boy, or actually one of the protagonists, if we count the boy and the coral gametes as contiguous, as both protagonists, which I think the book wants us to do. This boy is Ken Neddermeyer, and he's pictured in childhood on the left of the page as he watched his father's team send unmanned rockets towards the stars. So his father is an engineer for NASA. And in this picture, you can see that the ocean is a very small presence. It's framed by hordes of humans focused on the rocket launching. It's implied that mankind is too preoccupied with seeking to expand ever further from Earth to even consider the ocean. So contrasting with the microscopic of the previous page, we see a vision here of the telescopic. And this is an ideology that the book attempts to challenge. So the following spread maintains Ken on the left-hand side of the page, but this time the ocean is expanded to fill half the double page spread, with the imagery of the sunset and stars in the top right, kind of reprising the imagery of the coral gametes and sort of visually affirming the book's statement that Ken's dreams weren't in the stars, he loved the ocean. 2 pages later, we see Ken snorkeling in the ocean, surrounded by teeming life, lots of fish. The figure of the snorkeler from the front cover is now dwarfed by shoals of fish, described as a world of angelfish and sea stars. Angelfish are actually freshwater fish, so I think they mean a different kind of fish. But anyway, we're told that Ken learned to scuba dive and began collecting fish to keep and study at home. At one point, he had 30 aquariums in his bedroom, all bursting with life. Now, this is something that in the aquarium hobby is referred to as MTS, and it stands for multiple tank syndrome, because it's a well-known fact that you get one aquarium and then you can't stop. Your house will soon look like this. I think my bedroom looked like this when I was a teenager, much to the dismay of my parents, let's say. The water bill is always quite a lot higher when your daughter has 4 aquariums. And so the description of the aquariums bursting here, I think, suggests a sort of porosity between what Granata terms the green world in which the tank was placed, that is, one on Earth, or one on land rather, and the blue one it recreated. So actually, even as early as 1857, the aquarium was referred to as a parlor ocean, which I think hints at its important bridging function between the domestic and the wild, bringing the ocean into the parlor. Elizabeth Markio has pointed out the beneficial qualities of aquaria in cultivating empathy. Although one might start an aquarium due to aesthetic interest, the side effect of aquarium keeping is a personal response to aquatic organisms, and an aquarium helps link aquarists to an increasingly damaged aquatic world. And I can anecdotally certainly say this is true. The aquarium space is also used later in The Brilliant Deep. So we're told that Ken, when he's all grown up, operated a live rock farm in the Florida Keys. And the book on the left here tells us that what live rock is, that live rock is also something that you'll use if you have a marine aquarium. Live rocks aren't really alive. They're used in saltwater aquariums as decoration and to filter waste from the water, turning poisons like ammonia and nitrates into harmless compounds. This makes the water safer and healthier for everything that lives in it. So within the contained space of the aquarium, small quantities of live rock that are home to even smaller organisms can implicitly enact reparation of any damage to create a clean and harmonious ecosystem. And I think this fantasized healing process is implicitly extrapolated to the world's oceans. So healing in miniature that could happen on a macro scale as well. Now, in the final third of the book, the smallness of the coral colonies is repeatedly emphasized. We're told that each one is the size of a hand with the fingers stretched. But the focus is on the tiny coral. Here you see the human volunteer is faceless. The illustration is only showing their hand. So we're told that this is a new home, one the corals will help to build. And the focus is on the agency of the corals themselves. We're later told that they're not only surviving, but also reproducing. So Ken cultivates live rock to then set up in colonies in the Florida Keys to promote coral growth, which, as we know, is threatened by climate change. And the next scene reprises earlier shots of the scuba divers on the reef. But this time, if you look on the right, the humans are barely there. They're swimming away as ocean life moves in to fill the space left by their departure. The coral shifts to fill the space of the page, foregrounding the tiny coral gametes that hold the promise of new and restored ocean life. And the book ends with that repeated phrase, it starts with one, returning to the image that we saw earlier of the child looking out at the ocean at sunset. But this time the child has been replaced by a middle-aged bearded man, accompanied by a scuba oxygen canister on his left. And the light dancing on the water again evokes that imagery of the coral gametes, which you see throughout the book in these sort of dots of white. So with its focus on one, we might read this text within the wider context of environmental literature for children, which, as Echterling points out, does have a tendency to model a reductive environmentalism that reinforces neoliberal individualism. So she elaborates, green, and maybe we can also add blue, children's books tend to oversimplify and depoliticize ecological crisis and activism, presenting problems such as climate change or marine pollution as easily managed or corrected by individual actions alone, contained by clear temporal and spatial boundaries, and distinct from other persistent problems like class, gender, racial, and national inequalities. So obviously it's beyond the scope of my talk today to examine this to its fullest extent, although I do agree. But I've instead tried to offer a tentative exploration of what Echterling terms spatial boundaries, and the way that these texts I've just looked at via a microcosmic aesthetic construct a framed or contained arena within which they fantasize reparation for environmental damage. They too tap into dialogues of scalar change and reimagining that surround blue extinction in adult discussion, and they demonstrate how these strategies might percolate into the realm of children's fiction at both a narrative and an illustrative or aesthetic level, and might help to cultivate as a starting point a more empathetic relationship with the whole spectrum of marine life. So I think the clear spatial boundaries of the aquarium have a definitive role to play, allowing us to negotiate our relationship with slippery others in surprising and enlightening ways. We might see aquaria as stages upon which we can play out and interrogate our own relationship to the wider biosphere, and maybe reconsider the species hierarchies to which we might have become blindly and habitually accustomed. Maybe, sometimes, it takes a fish flung from the heavens and dropped into a freezer drawer to awaken these dormant curiosities, fan these sparks of empathy, and start these conversations. It might equally take a children's book, which is probably the preferable option rather than dropping fish from the sky. And it does matter, particularly if we see the aquarium as a microcosm for wider enactments of empathy and interspecies care and multi-species justice. So on that note, I just want to end with a quotation from the eulogy that I wrote for Troilus on Facebook back in September 2021. I worry there are still some people out there who will think I am crazy for loving a tiny fish this much. But if we can't unconditionally love with all our hearts all the tiniest, most helpless creatures in this world, what hope is there for any of us, really? And I will also end with a little memorial of Alice there. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your attention, and I would be very happy to hear your questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Elly, for this fascinating talk.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing. There we go. I'm back.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're in a real aquarium now. So we've already talked about it for your talk, but that part is not recorded. So you're in a real aquarium in Wrocław, of course, talking about fish and talking about aquarium and also talking about children's literature. I really enjoyed them. I really enjoyed the complexity of your talk and all of the little pop cultural references mixed with sophisticated use of theory and close analyses of the picture books, focusing on the multimodal nature of the picture book format. So I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure that there will be some questions. So please go ahead, use the chat function. So you can just write down your question, or you can raise your digital hand or your real, legit physical hand if you have your webcam on, and just let me know that you do have a question. And there was also a lot about memory, by the way, which is something that I specialize in, because your childhood recollections, and I also started thinking about my own experience and my own story connected to fish. And I think that you're absolutely right, because I also have one.
Yeah, I think we all do. I do too.
Yeah,
I'm certainly culpable in this as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. So my brother once had a goldfish. He got it from his girlfriend, and and we all wanted to feed the poor creature. Yeah.
Right.
So So we were over. Like we really wanted to feed that little creature, and I think that fish died.
Yeah, it's a bit like houseplants. Fish and houseplants have a lot in common. Like too much love is more likely to kill them than not enough. So overfeeding and overwatering are much more likely to kill fish and plants than the opposite, unfortunately.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. When it comes to the books you talked about, can you say something more about the presence of fish, of aquaria in children's literature, especially in picture books? Is it are there many books like that? Have you encountered many different types of books during your travels? Because I know that you travel a lot, so you've probably encountered different types of books in different places that you've visited. And I wonder whether there are countries where there are more books about the marine life and fish and aquaria. Is it just connected to, I don't know, cultural or socio-cultural circumstances, or maybe there are some global, let's say, trends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, so if I'm completely honest, I'm right at the beginning of this work, because I think I said this to you yesterday. It's a project that I've been had in my mind for a long time, but I keep getting distracted by sort of Taylor Swift related projects. But I would say it's not as common. Well, it sort of depends. So you certainly might find representations of aquaria in books that are not specifically about aquaria or even about fish. So a goldfish in a bowl is a kind of a sort of feature of sort of the domestic environment. You certainly might come across that. You also come across a lot of books about fish and underwater life, but they tend to focus, on the wider scale. So they tend to focus on, the oceans and on different types of marine life. You get quite a lot of the, these different types of fish. So there's a book called There Are Fish Everywhere that is a kind of, Someone's okay. Yeah, so there's not that many that I've come across that focus on aquaria and well, it's not just aquaria, but on the contained space in so much detail. But I'm still very much at the start of this research, so I'm not sure yet, what the kind of, I'd be curious to sort of in the end do a sort of statistical study and look at what percentage of children's books featuring fish actually featured contained aquatic spaces versus wider spaces. One book I do have is quite a beautiful book that a friend gave me called "This is a Poem That Heals Fish," and it features a sick fish in a tank, but then the fish, it's sort of almost kind of magical realist, I suppose. The fish kind of comes out of the tank and starts moving around the house. And that's one that I need to work into the project at some point. Regarding your question about globally differences, I have not thought about that yet, and that's something that I would be really interested to look at further. As this goes on, I would also be curious to think about how, the obvious, which would be, do you get increased representation of marine life in coastal nations, for example, versus, of course, landlocked nations, nations that have a very strong kind of fishing culture, for example, in the Mediterranean. I don't know. I would have to look into that for sure, but that would be really interesting to examine, I think.
Thank you. So I do have more questions, so I will I will ask them. So in your talk, you discussed the importance of aquaria. How would you respond to animal studies scholars and animal rights organizations who advocate against human practices of keeping pets?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and one that I've had debates with my colleagues about over lunch. I remember because I was talking about the Fish Olympics, which I showed a video of, and it led to a discussion of whether it is ever ethical to keep fish in an aquarium. Yeah, I think one of the problems is that fish are so widely bred for aquarists, for keeping in aquaria, that it would take a kind of global boycott to stop the trade. And yes, I suppose if we could all overnight stop breeding fish for aquaria and just let fish live in the wild, I would renounce my aquarium keeping for aesthetic purposes and be very happy about that. The sad fact is that that's not the case. Certain fish in particular, particularly Siamese fighting fish that I mentioned earlier, are horrendously inbred and widely bred for aquaria and also kept in terrible conditions. And this actually does lead to a lot of discussion among aquarists about also where you buy your fish from. If you buy your fish from big stores like PetSmart in the US that keep the fish in tiny cups, aren't you just supporting those practices? But what happens if you see a fish dying in a tiny cup and you want to rescue it and take it home, but you pay money for it? Aren't you encouraging these practices? My main answer basically is that it's really complicated, and I think in an ideal world, yes, we probably wouldn't keep fish in aquaria, but I think, to be honest, just in an ideal world, I would also argue that a lot of mammals are not kept in good conditions. We could talk about a lot of cats and dogs are not those that are actually abused, which is a different matter, but those who are kept by people who haven't really done a whole lot of research. Dogs in particular, about breeds of dogs. Also rabbits, very, very badly treated as pets. I think, if we can't stop aquarium keeping as a practice, what we can do is educate people on how to give the contents of the aquarium their best possible lives. There are some and I think it's also a case of very small fish, if you keep them in a large aquarium. And it's also fish that in the wild wouldn't have a very large territory, like Siamese fighting fish, which tend to live in rice paddies, so their actual natural territory is quite small. There is, I suppose, a more ethical argument for keeping them in a reasonably sized tank than to keep, for example, an orca in an aquarium, because that's a related issue. The keeping of killer whales in aquaria and the training of them and the use of them to perform for sports. And that's, I think we all agree by now, a really problematic circumstance. So I'm rambling. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. I think it's really tricky, and I think it depends on how one educates oneself, how one kind of cares for these organisms, and also, yeah, the question, I suppose, of why. I mean, if you have an aquarium in a dentist surgery that's just there for aesthetic purposes, is that different to a hobbyist who, for example, is breeding their own fish and keeping them in the best possible conditions? I'm not sure. And it's also, yeah, again, about where you buy your fish. So I know a lot of people that when I buy betters, I buy them from a special breeder. Like, I don't buy them from commercial outlets anymore because of the way they're shipped around the world, the way they're treated. But obviously not everyone does that. So yeah. Mindfulness, I think, and education are really important when it comes to these issues. And then we can take it from there, I suppose.
Thank you. We have two more questions. One is in the chat, and there's also someone whose digital hand is raised. So maybe let's start with the digital hand. Eleanor, please go ahead. And then I will read or Ella maybe wants to read the question.
Hi, Elly. Thank you for that. That was awesome. I love your background. I'm also loving the fish blouse, which nobody mentioned. Noticed that. Excellent. A few things occurred to me when you were talking about sort of geographical locations. Yes, in certain cultures, goldfish are lucky.
Yeah.
I wonder, in the UK, I mean, I'm probably just rambling, but the thing of winning a goldfish at the fair and taking it home, I've always thought that was quite a British thing. I don't know if that happens elsewhere. Does it happen all over?
I think it does. I'm not sure about all over. It certainly, I think, happens in the US, and it's also very common in the US. I've learned this through being on a lot of fish communities on Reddit. Sometimes they're even given away as kind of wedding favors, or as
really,
or as things that at baby showers and that kind of thing. Or sometimes just given to kids at school, that not as part of a kind of project, but just sort of given as little gifts. The amount of people who, will post saying, "Oh, I've been given this fish by so-and-so, help me keep it alive," is really quite shocking. Yes. So I don't think it's just a British thing. And yeah, I think you're certainly right about fish as lucky, all over East Asia, for example, the amount of fish motifs you see everywhere. But yeah, fish, I think, are also sort of used and displayed there as a kind of symbol of fortune, sometimes in good conditions, sometimes not so much.
But I was thinking about, British culture, fish and chips, everyone's got a story about fish, yeah. And then I was thinking about picture book theory, because as you were talking, I've done a quick Google of fish in children's literature, just out of interest, and most of the ones that came up were picture books.
Yeah.
To my mind, and I haven't really thought about this before your talk, but I would have thought there's quite a lot of similarity in illustrations. I would assume sort of blue-green backgrounds. I know there's lots of different fish, but, all fish kind of look the same. So I wondered how much sort of picture book theory you might be using or have used previously, and if there's anything in, for example, a picture book theory tells us that a frame, for example, blocks you in and cuts you off from other things. So is a frame a kind of an aquarium, a metaphorical aquarium, and that kind of thing? So just sort of what extent is picture book theory part of your research, I think, is the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That is sort of where I'm going with all of this. So I'm not a picture book scholar by training and by any means. So the sort of analysis I've done here of the picture books is kind of it's sort of during really what I noticed, but that's certainly what I'm working towards, is this idea of framing. So the way in which with the book about the coral gametes, I'm really interested in the way that sort of uses negative space and also uses this recurring motif of the sometimes they look like stars, sometimes they look like coral gametes, but they're these white dots. And absolutely, I think the framing is going to be really important. The picture book as a kind of frame that encourages this microscopic or this microcosmic aesthetic, where the aquarium comes to take the space of the picture book. But then at the same time, you also have picture books where you have the framing of the space of the page, but then the aquarium within. So you almost have a kind of layered framing.
Okay.
Which I'm interested to sort of think further about what that means, what that is inviting the reader to step into. But then you also have picture books that are more immersive, where it's almost as if the frame is supposed to disappear and the reader is beneath the ocean, for example, and then the reader is part of this teeming mass of life and you have the fish moving around. And I want to think about whether that's more effective in cultivating empathy because the space, the distance between the reader and the underwater space disappears, or whether it's actually potentially preferable to have this aquatic space, this contained space that might feel more manageable to a child. And there I want to use this idea of the miniature, which I've also worked on in relation to a little bit to dolls' houses and also the home, the kind of miniature home. There's a swathe of children's books from the post-war period that look at miniature houses that I'm really that I've worked on before, and so I want to think about is the aquarium a kind of miniature house, and does it have a similar function? But as I said, I'm sort of at the beginning of all of this, so that's really helpful in helping me figure out where I'm going to go next with it.
Well, I'm going to stop talking in a minute. I've got 2 books that are part of my research, which has nothing to do with fish, but The Quest for the Cockle Implant, which was actually written by a 9-year-old, just out of interest, and Deep Light by Frances Harding. So they're both set under the sea. So if you haven't come across those, not exactly fish, but underwater setting. So anyway, thank you very much. I'll turn my camera off again.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have one more long question and comment in the chat. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I've got a question concerning marine life care and class economic background. The last picture book example, as well as the other picture book on environmental issues, I have read, tend to show young protagonists from very similar middle-class backgrounds that facilitate certain access to activism. Example, in your last example with the boy in a large private room and learning to scuba dive is not exactly an affordable hobby. Would you say picture books about marine life focus on and address readers from the same socio-economic background, or are there contrasting examples you can think of?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. That also, I think, relates to what you were saying, Mateusz, as well, about sort of cultural differences.
Yes.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, as I say, I this is something I need to look into further. There's a lot. This eventually, I'm envisaging this being a monograph project, but this is the first piece of research I've done towards it. But no, you're absolutely right. I was thinking about that, learning to scuba dive. If anyone here scuba dives, very expensive hobby. Aquarium keeping, also an incredibly expensive hobby. But I think, as far as I can tell, there are some, I'm trying to think of there's a couple of things I would say. There are some picture books for children that don't have human protagonists at all. There's one, I now can't remember the name, infuriatingly, but if you're interested, send me an email and I'll dig it out because I know I have it written down somewhere. It focuses on the journey of sea otters, and I think the sea otter protagonist is called Sophie or Sophia. I can't remember if it's written. I found it when I was living and working in Oslo. I can't remember if it's by a Norwegian author, but it focuses on the journeys of these sea otters, and it's a very nice picture book. It doesn't really touch upon kind of activist themes. It's not directly addressing climate change or anything like that. You have quite a lot of children's picture books where the animals themselves are the protagonists, and there, of course, you can argue that they're I suppose a little bit more democratic in terms of their audience because they're focusing on the animals themselves. In terms of those that have human protagonists, it's also tricky because at the moment the books I'm looking at tend to be from the global north. So yes, there is a sort of bias towards a certain kind of protagonist for sure. I think my main answer is I don't know yet, and I think it's something that is definitely going to be a factor of the research that I'm doing. Who gets to go into that aquatic space or engage with that aquatic space, because some of the means of engaging with it, like for example aquaria and diving, are obviously out of reach to many people. Even for example snorkeling, of course, requires equipment. But then there are some picture books that do engage with conservation initiatives, for example, safeguarding sea turtles, that do feature kind of a more diverse cast of characters. I can't think of the title of the one that I want to talk about off the top of my head, but I have come across this. So it does exist, but it's important also to be, I think, aware of who the text envisages as the, I suppose, safeguarder or protector of the aquatic realms, and how that might be slightly flawed. Thank
you so much, Elly, for answering this long an important question.
It's very important. Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Yeah, and it's for sure connected to something that I was thinking about while listening to your talk. So we don't have time for more questions, but there's something that I would like to say. So your research on fish is, in a way, connected to your research on Taylor Swift. So I've been thinking about Taylor Swift and fish. And in the Lover music video, she becomes fish, literally. So she's in this fish bowl, and I remember reading somewhere that it's her favorite scene in the music video, and I think that's a video she also, I think, directed or co-directed. And also in Lavender Haze, she's surrounded by pink fish. So there is for sure a link, and I would love to hear more about what you think about these entanglements, the links between Taylor Swift and fish. And this is something that maybe we can talk about on Thursday during your class, unless you want to address this question now. But if you don't want to talk about it, I can wait.
No, I mean, I will certainly address it a little bit now, and almost certainly more on Thursday. And actually the amount of people, there's a sort of meme that was going around during the Eras tour that has a really beautiful betta fish that's because the pretty ones are boys, but is kind of pastel pink and white, and someone's photoshopped a guitar and says this fish looks like it's ready for the first bridge of the evening, because basically the point being that it's all pastel pink colors, and it looks like Taylor's aesthetic for quite a lot of the sets on the Eras tour. So the Lover bodysuit and also the enchanted dress, and so many people sent me that meme because they know I love betta or Siamese fighting fish, and they know I love Taylor Swift, but also her iconography, right? If you think about the koi guitar, which has become really sort of iconic. And I sort of wonder about that. I actually don't know if there's a sort of reason or a history behind the koi guitar, but it does make me think of what I think Eleanor was saying about the iconography of fish being lucky. I don't know if it's sort of related to that. It's also, but I love the sort of koi symbolism of it. But the fish is a sort of, I think it's used very symbolically in those two moments that you mentioned. This idea, I'm also now thinking of, I wasn't for some reason just thinking of the Pink Floyd line about two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl. The fish in a bowl is often used, I suppose, idiomatically and I guess symbolically as a symbol of kind of entrapment and also of being on display, which fits with the kind of Taylor Swift, which fits with Taylor Swift very well, right? Of course, being a celebrity, being constantly on display. Also in Lavender Haze, which is a song about having a relationship exposed to media scrutiny, right? And so I think it would make a lot of sense that we and I think that's also a good use of that symbolism because goldfish in a bowl, they are trapped, right? They are inappropriately kept in a very bad environment. But bowls, by the way, are a terrible, terrible shape for an aquarium because there's less surface area to water volume, which means that there's much less oxygen available in the water, which means that the fish will have trouble breathing. So that's why bowls, you should never keep any kind of fish in a bowl. So a fish in a bowl, symbols of all sorts of, I think, problematic things. And I think that's the way that she's using it. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, of course, she also dives into the stage on the Eras tour and swims, right? So yes. Watery imagery, Taylor as fish, it actually appears quite a lot. And there's probably other examples that I can't think of now off the top of my head, but it would be really interesting to look. So in the class we're going to do on Thursday, I think a lot about forests and plants, but it might be really interesting to kind of literally, or not literally, dive into the watery landscapes of Swift's writing. Yeah.